Hello, I'm Gyles Brandreth, and welcome to a most unusual tea party. We're celebrating the world of Winnie the Pooh, and I'm dressed in this rather over-the-top and ridiculous jumper because I love the whole world of Winnie the Pooh, and I want to be down in the forest with Winnie the Pooh and Piglet and Kanga and Roo and all the rest. That's where I really want to be, and where I am in my mind much of the time. We're going to be talking about the world of Winnie the Pooh, the character created by A. Milne in the 1920s. But he was also a real bear. Christopher Robin and Winnie the Pooh. That's what we're here to celebrate. And I imagine you're here because you want to celebrate them too. My role is really to ask the questions. But I've got a few things to say as well, because I was lucky enough to know and have as a friend the real Christopher Robin. A. Milne was a hugely successful playwright, journalist, novelist, who in the 1920s began writing children's books. And with 4 children's books, only 70,000 words in all, 2 books of verses and 2 stories about the adventures of Christopher Robin and Winnie the Pooh, he conquered the world. And he created a world of magic that is living with us still a century later. So there was a real Christopher Robin, and I was lucky enough to know him. He was a most delightful person. So that's the reason I'm here. But I've got 2 very special people with me, and they're here for very good reasons too. One is the writer Jane Riordan. Now, you're here because you've written the prequel to the Winnie the Pooh stories called Once There Was a Bear. And we're going to discover all about that a little later on. But tell me about you and Winnie the Pooh. How were you introduced to Winnie the Pooh? What does Pooh mean to you?
Well, for me, it's very hard to remember what came first, whether it was the books or playing poohsticks. I was lucky enough to grow up very near a river, and my sister and I used to go down all the time and play poohsticks. So I can't remember what came first, but it's very much part of my childhood, and we would play it very sensibly, 2 nice little girls. And then sometimes our naughty cousins would come to visit, and we played a very different game of poohsticks. It was much more like the original story where Eeyore ends up in the river. But yeah, so it was so much part of my childhood that I can't remember the first time I heard the stories. I do remember that we had a record, and it was the song of Christopher Robin visiting Buckingham Palace.
Oh, the Changing Guard
Changing
at
Guard
Buckingham
at Buckingham Palace.
Christopher Robin went down with Alice.
And I love that song because for me at the time, London was this very far away, exciting place that I only went to, maybe at Christmas for a pantomime or something. So that really resonates with me, that poem. I still hear it as a song in my head.
Well, the London of the 1920s is the backdrop for the world of A. Milne when he created this story. And at the heart of London in the 1920s, as well as Buckingham Palace, was the Buckingham Palace of the retail world in the shape of the shop Harrods, the great department store Harrods. And we're very lucky that Sebastian Wormel, one of Harrods' archivists, is with us today. Before you tell us about Harrods and Winnie the Pooh, and there really is a key connection, tell us about Sebastian and Winnie the Pooh. What does Winnie the Pooh mean to you?
Well, I think the earliest I remember are, in fact, the verses from when we were very young. Christopher Robin going to Buckingham Palace, the Dormouse with the Delphiniums, those sort of wonderful poems, which really stay in your mind. He was a brilliant writer of light verse, children's verse.
Yeah. Those 2 books, when we were very young and now we are 6, written, I think, between 1926 and 1928, were among the most successful books of children's poetry ever written. They're formidable and they're still in print. And I love all those verses. They're completely enchanting. And the songs were first recorded in the 1920s and were hugely successful as records. And among the people to enjoy them at that time was the Queen. She, when she was a little girl, had those records played to her and loved them. Of course, the Queen shops at Harrods, as we know. So now explain to us the Harrods connection with Winnie the Pooh.
Well, the Milnes were very lucky because they lived just round the corner from the biggest, most prestigious, most luxurious department store in London, Harrods, which had grown really from the 1890s to become this huge building, filling a whole island site, and had the motto, Harrods for everything for everybody, everywhere, and lived up to that name. So, of course, everything includes toys, and Harrods' toy department was the best, one of the best in London. At that time, at the time when the Milnes were living there, 1920s, early 1920s, the toy department was actually on the first floor, where the fashion departments are now, because until a little bit later, the floors above were all filled by flats. So the shop was only on the lower 2 floors of the building.
Oh, intriguing. So
So
it's like a great big block of mansion flats.
yes, there were mansion
Those
flats.
like late Victorian mansion flats
Yeah.
that were all over those parts of Kensington.
Exactly.
So here we are in Knightsbridge. There's this huge building upstairs, flats for essentially middle class and upper middle class people.
That's right.
And on the ground floor and first floor, this huge department store that sold everything.
Everything.
In my day, in the 1950s, when I was a little boy, I remember there was a zoo next to the children's department, the toy department. Does the zoo still exist?
No, that's gone now.
The zoo has gone, probably not politically correct to keep, but we loved it. And I remember going there with my mother, and we didn't want to buy Winnie the Pooh, a bear. We wanted to buy a monkey. But my father said, no monkeys. We got a parrot called Mitu, which was, I'm sorry to say, you no longer have the zoo, so I can't really complain. It destroyed most of we lived in a mansion flat around the corner, and it destroyed most of the flat. This bird flew around eating the woodwork, eating the spines, the binding of the books, and eventually my father, though he didn't admit this, left the window open overnight, and it flew. And so if you see parakeets all over West London, it's my father who set the first one out. So this is a store that sells everything.
Yes.
And A.A. Milne, the writer, Alan Alexander Milne and his wife Daphne live around the corner, and they have a little boy born in
1920.
Christopher Robin Milne, nicknamed Blue, I think, when he was a little boy.
No,
Moon.
Alan was blue.
Very good. And what happens?
Well, they're thinking of a first birthday present for him. So Daphne goes round the corner to Harrods and looks for a teddy bear. Now, the first teddy bears we see in Harrods catalogues in our archive are about 1906. And after that, they never leave it. The teddy bear is a constant in the toy department and hardly changes. So the earliest teddy bear is very like the bear that Daphne Milne bought. It's obvious. Harrods is around the corner. Where to buy a teddy bear? Has to be Harrods.
And at those days, was Harrods selling a range of teddy bears? I mean, the people watching will know all this, but the teddy bear began life both in Europe with the Steiff family creating bears in Germany, and at the same time in America around 1903. Became hugely popular as that decade wore on, and by the time we're talking about the 1920s, there were lots of different German ones, American companies, and British companies. What were the bears that Harrods was selling?
If you look in the Harrods catalogues, they very proudly state they are British-made bears. And in the early 20s, and certainly in 1921, the First World War was still too close for the store to be selling German goods. So whereas earlier in the century, there would have been German bears on sale, we know at the time that Mrs. Milne went there, we would only have had British-made bears. And in fact, the bears Harrods was selling, I mean, a range of bears, but the most popular bears were the bears made by J.K. Farnell, who were the leading manufacturers of teddy bears. In fact, in 1921, they were extending their teddy bear factory in Acton to produce even more of them. These would have been the bears that Daphne saw at Harrods. They would later were branded as Farnell Alpha bears. Farnell was later taken over by Merrythought, who are still making exactly the same bears today.
It's wonderful. I have a teddy bear collection. I have more than 1,000 bears, and they now live at Newby Hall in North Yorkshire, near Ripon. And we do indeed have old Farnell bears, and we have Merrythought bears. We do have some German bears too, made by the Steiff family, but I'm pleased that we're sticking with British bears for this. So we think it's a Farnell bear. Mrs. Milne goes, what size would it have been, the one that she bought?
I can't remember. It was a standard size, so about this sort of size, I think. Yeah. You can see in the photographs of the young Christopher Robin with the bear, it's a sizable bear, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, I'm saying that asking you, because you've only seen the photographs, it's clear. I've actually handled the original Winnie the Pooh, who now lives in the children's department of the New York Public Library, for a story we can explain maybe a little bit later, how this great iconic British bear, as you've established, ends up in a New York library. And you may be wanting to join me on the campaign to get Winnie the Pooh back here, at least for a holiday, if not for all time. So Mrs. Milne goes in and buys this bear. It is indeed about this size, and takes it home and gives it to Christopher Robin. And what is it called? Anything at that time?
I think the earliest name is Edward Bear, isn't it? The rather formal name for the bear.
Yes.
But as Christopher Robin gets a bit older, he starts giving the bear, naming the bear himself. So Pooh, we're not quite sure where that comes from. Winnie is named after the bear he'd seen at the zoo, of course.
Well, you say, of course, as though everybody knows this. I think the Pooh element comes in from him dismissing swans and going, Pooh, Pooh. That's, I think, where you can confirm that?
Yes,
got that
that's
right?
what Milne says, certainly one of the introductions, yeah.
Yeah, so the Pooh comes in from he's getting rid of some swans that he's a nuisance, possibly, in Kensington Gardens. And the Winnie, tell us about Winnipeg.
I didn't know everything, but it's a bear that had been adopted as a mascot by a Canadian regiment. And then when they went off to war, they left the bear with London Zoo. So it became hugely popular attraction at the zoo. And the young Christopher Robin saw it. I don't know how old he would have been when he went there, but I think
he went regularly, actually.
Yeah.
I think it was a real favourite outing, and he always made straight for Winnipeg because it was his favourite animal in the zoo.
This is Winnie short for Winnipeg because it was a Canadian bear.
And there is, to this day, a rather fine statue of Winnipeg at the Regent's Park Zoo, which I think they like to call themselves that rather than London Zoo. Don't ask me why. But anyway, so here is this bear, Edward Bear, officially. And in fact, there's a poem which refers to him as Edward Bear. But as time goes by, this name evolves. Winnie from Winnipeg, Pooh from getting rid of the swans. So Winnie the Pooh is born. And Winnie the Pooh, is there a bear? Do you sell at Harrods a bear called Winnie the Pooh?
I'm not at all sure. You'll have to ask my colleagues about that.
Well, you live in the past, not in the present. You are the archivist, what is currently on. So, Winnie the Pooh exists as a bear then,
Yes.
and is a much loved bear. Let's just actually unravel Winnie the Pooh, get onto the stories, because people's picture of Pooh varies. There is the original Winnie the Pooh, the bear we're talking about, that was bought in Harrods literally 100 years ago this year.
That's the point.
That's what
It's
we're
the centenary,
celebrating.
yes, yeah.
100 years since this bear was bought, and then gradually other animals came to join, and they were other toys that joined the party, yes?
Absolutely.
As the 20s went on.
Yeah.
But when the books come out and the illustrations are created, explain to me why the Winnie the Pooh in the drawings, in the original books, don't look entirely like the Winnie the Pooh, the Farnell bear that your colleagues at Harrods sold in 1921 and that can still be seen in the New York Public Library.
So the illustrator, Shepard, had a young son at the time when he was asked to illustrate these books. And he had a toy bear called Growler. And so actually Growler was the model for the illustrations rather than the real Winnie.
Yeah, so this is we should have warned you. There should have been really a trigger warning at the beginning of this to people who may be alarmed to find that Winnie the Pooh that we're talking about actually in the illustrations is a bear called Growler. It wasn't the one created by A.A. Milne, but was the one created by the artist. But the truth is, it's a joint creation. Everybody played a part in this. Daphne Milne, A.A. Milne, Christopher Robin, Ernest Shepard, they all...
Harrods.
And of course, Harrods, absolutely. And as we're going to discover, Jane as well is part of this rich mix. So the drawings are created by Ernest Shepard, and he creates this sort of world. Eventually, and again controversially for some people, when Disney come in on the scene and have to create for them a sort of broader brush version of the world of Winnie the Pooh, there is yet another look to Winnie the Pooh, isn't there?
Yeah.
Some people, I'm actually totally comfortable with Disney illustrations. I love the Shepard. I love actually every manifestation. Do you have a feeling about it?
I'm very loyal to the original books, I think, really. I've actually, I was I was doing a radio interview earlier in the week, and they played the theme tune to the film, and they're like, "How does it make you feel?" And I was like, "Oh gosh, I haven't really immersed myself in the Disney Pooh because I didn't want to sort of lose the voice of Milne, so I've stuck to the classics."
And in your book, which we're going to talk about in a moment, the illustrations there evoke E.H. Shepard rather than you've gone back to the original.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the illustrator Mark Burgess has got a really long history with Winnie the Pooh, actually, because he was the guy who was lucky enough to actually be asked to colour up Shepard's original black and white illustrations. So he's been working on Winnie the Pooh for many, many years, and he's done a great job on this one. It's really lovely.
As I'm sure you know, the real Christopher Robin had mixed feelings about Winnie the Pooh as the years went by. Obviously, when he was a little boy, he loved his bear. And when he was first told the stories by his father, he loved those stories. But as Winnie the Pooh became famous, and eventually world famous, and as he became a teenager, his fondness for being this little boy kneeling at the foot of the bed and for being this rather twee character, as I think it was Dorothy Parker, writing under the name A Constant Reader in America, read one of the books, and her review was, "Constant Reader flowed up." She found it all a bit sick-making, and Christopher Robin himself was distressed to be this character in the storybook and fell out in a way with both his parents, and certainly accused his father at one stage of building his reputation by standing on a small boy's shoulders. But by the time I got to know Christopher Robin, when he was in his 60s, he'd mellowed, and he accepted what had happened. He accepted his parents, he accepted Disney. He was grateful indeed for the money that came from Disney because he was able to do lots of good work in his family and for different charities. So he was more relaxed about it. Though when he saw my Winnie the Pooh, which is on show at our Teddy Bear Museum, he said, "That isn't right, you know. The smile isn't right. Disney had to give Pooh a smile. And the real Winnie the Pooh doesn't smile. So if you go to the Teddy Bear Museum, you'll find our Winnie the Pooh with his back to you. According to Christopher Robin, he had to have his face facing the wall. And he loved best, definitely, the Shepard drawings. So just give us some more of Harrods in the 1920s and the legacy of A.A. Milne, Winnie the Pooh. Just evoke that. Take us, because you obviously live it. I mean, I couldn't believe when you came into the room, I thought, oh, they've hired somebody who looks like Winnie the Pooh if he were a human being.
Thank you. I think an interesting thing, 5 years after the bear is bought, the book Winnie the Pooh is published. And Harrods, we have copies of a weekly sort of magazine price list that was sent out to customers called Harrods News. And the whole page of this was devoted to this new book, Winnie the Pooh. Of course, the Harrods customers knew Milne because of his writing for Punch, and especially because of this huge success of the When We Were Very Young. So it's a new book by the author of When We Were Very Young. And it's saying, hurry up to the book department and reserve your first edition. But interestingly, it's referred to as a gift book. It's not described as a children's book at all. It's get this, but this is by a well-known author. You know the characters. It's a gift book. And I think that's interesting because I think it confirms that in a lot of ways, Winnie the Pooh is not only a children's book. It's a more universal sort of book.
Would you endorse that?
Yeah, certainly. If you try and line up some 5-year-olds and read them Winnie the Pooh, they get quite fidgety, actually. Because I went to Ashdown Forest once a few years ago with my kids and some children. I thought, oh, how lovely, we'll sit up on the top and we'll read. And I had to do a bit of a paraphrase, actually, because it's quite sophisticated and the humour, there's definitely a lot in there for adults, isn't there? So I think, maybe the sweet spot is maybe 7 or 8 when you're a little bit older, and then into adulthood, of course, because we all love it still.
It's a companion all your life. I mean, A.A. Milne was a most brilliant writer. You mentioned Punch, and younger viewers won't know what Punch was. It is to do with Judy, but it was a magazine. It was for 100 years and more, it was the most popular comical magazine. It took a witty look at the world. And A.A. Milne was the deputy editor, and he was a columnist for many years. But
and Shepard illustrated.
Yes. And he also was a playwright. I mean, he wrote witty and successful West End plays that were put on here and on Broadway. So he was a brilliant writer. I mean, his way with words is, for me, quite magical. So Harrods has created I think we must mention this because people may want this as a collector's item, a special edition in Harrods Green, which is fantastic. Harrods Green is a very special colour. I live in London and my house was painted. I live near the Harrods on the River Thames, the Harrods Depository, and the house that I bought 30 years ago, you could recognise it because the man who bought it had bought a job lot of Harrods Green paint. So my house was this extraordinary colour. When I was a little boy, this colour was very potent. And there used to be, I don't know if there used to be people who, do you still have lifts at Harrods?
Yes.
Well, I'm sure you do. But they're probably not manned by people. When I was a little child, they were manned by usually World War I veterans, often disabled veterans, who were given this important job and wore these wonderful uniforms with hats. And as I seem to remember, if you were a little boy, and maybe a little girl too, when you got into the lift, he saluted you. And what floor did I go up to for the children's department?
Ooh, I think it would have been the third floor.
I think it was the third floor, where there was the children's department, there was the zoo, and there was the hairdresser. And I got, until I was about 15, I only got my hair cut at Harrods. So I mean, I think I'm so excited to meet you. So do you know about Harrods in the 1950s as well?
Oh yeah.
Good.
Yes.
Well, look, that'll be another episode if Fane Productions can bring us that. We'd love that.
I must just mention that Harrods has also produced a special hamper to celebrate the book as well. So,
what's in the hamper? Honey?
Hamper is, you get a bear, get the book, and you get honey. Yes.
A bear, a book, and a honey. Who could want anything more? A bear, a book, and a honey. Let's give people a flavour. Get your own honey. Hug your bear. And let's give you a flavour of what's in the book, because I think this new book, Once There Was a Bear, is a complete enchantment. And I think Christopher Robin would love to hear the stories, and I think A.A. Milne would have been proud of them.
One very good thing about this growing up that Christopher Robin had secretly been doing, probably at night when no one was looking, was that he was now big enough to have interesting conversations with Pooh. And he was also now big enough to visit the zoo. The what? Said Pooh. The zoo, said Christopher Robin. Oh, said Pooh. Is that a kind of surprise? I think so, replied Christopher Robin, with elephants and hippopotamuses in it. Elepotamuses and hippofants, said Pooh, very much excited. He had seen some of these in Christopher Robin's books, but to think that they were real. And the very next day, Christopher Robin, Winnie the Pooh, Piglet, and Eeyore found themselves at the gates of London Zoo. It should be explained that Eeyore had been somewhat uncertain about leaving the house. Fuss and bother and trampled by elephants had been just some of his words about the trip, but here they were. These were some of the animals that they visited. The penguins were all playing a funny game of all pretending to be the same penguin. One would waddle around stiff-necked and then all the others would copy him. One would flop beak first into their pool and then all the others would do the same. It seemed to Pooh that it was a game that they'd been practicing for a very long time, as they were exceedingly good at it. The lions were much more lazy. Piglet was very relieved that they were so far away, snoozing in a patch of sunlight at the far side of their enclosure so that they could hardly be seen at all. They also kept their teeth to themselves, out of sight, which Piglet thought was the right thing to do. The giraffes wanted to be seen and stood very close to the crowd. It hurt Pooh's short neck as he put his head right back and looked up the long neck of the tallest giraffe at its faraway head with blinking eyelashes and slow, leaf-munching mouth. The elephants, or elepots, as Pooh called them absent-mindedly when he was thinking about honey, were picking up hay with their trunks, curling them up and round to carefully place into their mouths. What long trunks! Cried Christopher Robin as an elephant waded into a pool and showered itself with a powerful stream of water. I thought they had trunks for packing and taking on holiday, said Piglet, but these ones are much more fun, he added, as a particularly big splash left them standing in a puddle of water. Christopher Robin laughed and skipped on to see his most favourite animal in the whole zoo, Winnie, who had been rescued and brought to live at London Zoo by a kind Canadian soldier. Winnie the bear was not to be confused with our bear, Winnie the Pooh. His name was Winnipeg for long and Winnie for short, but he was not related to Winnie the Pooh. This Winnie was much more growly and brown and as big as 3 Winnies, Poohs, not pegs, standing on each other's heads, which they would never do. But if they did, that's how tall they would be.
Some lovely moments there from Once There Was a Bear. Jane Riordan is the author. Decorations by Mark Burgess, inspired, of course, by A. Milne and E.H. Shepard. And I've just opened it and seen these glorious full-colour end papers here. This is obviously Mrs. Milne arriving at Harrods back in 1921 to buy the original Winnie the Pooh. Sebastian, who was with us, he's gone back to Harrods now. But his parting shot was to tell us that in Warsaw, there is a street named after Winnie the Pooh, a reminder that this is a global character. Now, you've done something very, very bold, Jane. You've given us a prequel to 2 of the greatest children's classics ever written, Tales of Before It All Began. Explain to me how this came about. Who are you? And why have you had the nerve to take on one of the best writers of the English language, who has created a world that, well, rings bells from, Westminster to Warsaw, from Winnipeg to Waterloo?
No, I was told you were going to be kind and ask kind questions.
I know I am.
Oh,
No, these are kind questions.
I have to justify
because
myself.
I've read the book and I know it works. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
Who are you and why
who
do
am
you
I?
do this?
Who am I? So I've worked for a number of years at the publisher of Winnie the Pooh. So I've been lucky enough to be working on these wonderful books behind the scenes. We publish the 4 original books that we've talked about, and then alongside Disney, we create other stories from time to time to just keep the legacy going. So I was in a brainstorming session probably about 4 years ago now, and we were talking about what could we do for the 95th anniversary, and we all had our thinking hats on, and I came up with the idea that we could do a prequel, because I knew there were these great stories. We know all these real things that happened to Christopher Robin, so it kind of, there were stories already there just waiting to be written. So I came up with the idea. It went off on a PowerPoint slide somewhere to the trustees, but it never occurred to me that I would be writing it. And then a few years went by, and we were starting to look for an author, and 3 of us were asked to write a sample, and I was lucky enough to be chosen. So yeah, all very unexpected and amazing.
Well, I think they made the right choice.
Oh, thank you.
So your idea was to do a prequel. What happened first, and how did you begin to work at that? Because with A.A. Milne, we know, because he wrote these children's verses first, we know that he began telling the stories, and that's often how it does happen. One of the other great classics was Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and Lewis Carroll, as Charles Dodgson, he began by telling these stories to some young children that he got to know. A.A. Milne told these stories to his own son, Christopher Robin. What was the genesis for you?
So for me, I know these books back to front, obviously, as many of us do, but it was my job as well. So I looked very much at the structure of how Milne had approached it, and each of the volumes is divided into 10 stories. So that was a way for me not to feel overwhelmed by the enormity of writing a prequel, and just think, okay, well, what 10 stories would I like to tell? Because they all stand alone.
10 little adventures.
Yeah, 10 little adventures, yeah. I mean, when I say stories, sometimes not a lot happens in Winnie the Pooh. It's more about a feeling or just sitting around,
Indeed,
doing nothing much, lots of chat. It doesn't have to be a big
just holding hands
moment.
with Piglet is enough, isn't it?
Exactly. So I knew that I wanted the book to start in London. And so I dedicated a chapter to the Harrods story, of course.
So that's when it begins. You begin with Christopher Robin finding his Winnie the Pooh.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
And it's Harrods, and it's the 1920s.
And Gyles, I had to do a lot of research. So I thought Winnie the Pooh would probably need to go to the food hall, because we know that he's often a little peckish. So I obviously had to carry out some thorough research in the food hall. In my story, I've taken a little bit of artistic license. Winnie the Pooh is nearly bought by a different child, but she gets a bit distracted by the chocolates, and so he's thrown aside in a corner of the food hall and found there. So there's a bit of artistic license.
Oh, well, no, but that's good. You introduced Jeopardy.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Oh, yeah.
Jeopardy, that's what they call
yeah.
it, the modern thriller writer, right at the beginning. And there's a girl, too, in the case.
I know.
The rival, Christopher Robin's rival. She doesn't get it. She moves on.
She moves on.
And he gets Winnie the Pooh. Is the bear called Winnie the Pooh already?
Well, so this was a bit of a complexity in writing the book because we know he wasn't named until Christopher Robin could speak and name him. So in the very first chapter, actually, the first chapter is them deciding to tell these earlier stories. And so we say, if you don't mind, reader, we will call him Winnie the Pooh because otherwise he's going to get ever so confused. So we call him Pooh throughout, even though we know his name would have come a few years later.
And what for you is the essence of the magic of Pooh? I mean, why has he lasted 100 years?
Oh, it's so it's just so joyful and innocent, and it's funny, isn't it? I mean, it just makes you laugh. And I think what I loved about it as a child was the fact that there were no adults in these books. There's a child and his friends in a wood doing whatever they like all day. No one's calling them in for lunch. No one's asking them to do their homework. There's just amazing kind of freedom to it. And I'm sure that Christopher Robin's life wasn't like that. I'm sure he had to go and wash his hands and have his lunch and so on. But it's just lovely to imagine that could be possible and that you could just have days like that doing not much at all.
And which of the other characters did you bring in, and how quickly did you bring them into the stories?
So I know Tigger's a massive favourite, but Tigger was a problem for me because he only comes in to the second book, The House at Pooh Corner. So Tigger wasn't allowed to be there, but I snuck him in because I thought otherwise he's gonna kick off, isn't he? He's gonna go crazy if he's not included. So I snuck him into the first chapter when they're all talking about telling these stories. So he got a story all to himself at the very beginning. And then unfortunately I couldn't include him for the others. So the main protagonists are Eeyore, who's my absolute favourite one to write, and Piglet and Pooh, of course, yeah. Because they were the earliest toys that Christopher Robin received. So they would have been there in the London nursery. Yeah.
And there is always, one feels when reading the originals that there's a kind of philosophy behind it. There's a kind of depth to it. Did you try and capture that, or did you just write the stories and hope that would emerge?
Well, I hope so. I mean, there's a real wisdom to Pooh, isn't there? That's so understated. I don't know if you're familiar with Benjamin Hoff's book, The Tower of Pooh, which has been very
Huge
successful.
success.
Yeah. And I was rereading it the other day, and it's amazing how much people have read into Pooh and how deep it goes, actually.
Yeah.
So I can't promise that I've captured all of that, but I've had a go.
And interestingly, if you go onto Google, you see endless quotes supposedly by Winnie the Pooh.
Yeah.
And these are often not by Winnie the
No,
Pooh.
I know.
They are edited versions of a Disneyfied version of Winnie the Pooh,
Yeah.
because he wrote quite complicated sentences often.
Yes.
A.A. Milne.
Yeah.
Did you find that you had to simplify it slightly?
I perhaps did a little bit, but I did try to be
True
to that
to his
structure.
style.
Yeah, I'm often asked by, at work let's have a little snippet, a quote. And actually, it's very difficult to do a short Winnie the Pooh quote because the wisdom and the humour normally is over the course of a conversation. So I send off this paragraph, and the PR team, whatever, is saying, no, we need something short and snappy. I'm like, well, I'm sorry, you have to have a slightly longer attention span for the real Milne.
And do you have some favourite lines yourself? Do you have some favourite moments?
I think
Poohisms?
Yeah, I mean, I think my favourite would have to be when Pooh is offered a snack, and he's asked if he would like honey or condensed milk with his bread, and he sort of instinctively he says both, and then so as not to seem rude, he says, "But don't worry about the bread." So it's brilliant.
That's nice.
Yeah.
That's very nice. And with these, is there going to be? This has been a huge success. This actually says this is for the 95th birthday.
Yes, that's
the book
right.
was published in October 1926.
Yeah,
and was a huge bestseller right from the beginning.
it
wasn't
was. Yeah,
and has never looked back.
yeah.
And when I, some years later, after the books were written, in fact, I think it was 60 years later, wrote a play about A.A. Milne and Christopher Robin, with music by Julian Slade, who was a composer who'd written a very popular musical called Salad Days. And that's how I got to know Christopher Robin. And we had Christopher Robin played by Aled Jones. And he was a boy.
Wow.
Remember, he was a boy
of course.
soprano.
Yeah.
And when he began singing some of the songs, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. So it was enchanting. So is there going to be a show? Is there going to be a movie? Is this just the beginning of the adventure?
Well, I don't know about that. Winnie the Pooh's a complicated one because there's the Disney involvement, and then but the original books and any prequels and sequels that we create are very much owned by the estate of A.A. Milne and E.H. Shepard, so they're quite separate from the Disney arrangement. So,
well, that's good in a sense that you feel you're protecting the legacy.
Yeah.
How did you guard against it being something that you might find in an antique shop? How did you make sure that it was alive for us today? We're not blowing off the cobwebs of old Pooh.
Well, I'm hoping that even, when you read the original books, there's no sense of kind of stuffiness, or they're as fresh today as they always were. So I think by continuing with that voice, I'm hoping that it's also fresh. I also had a bit of fun because I challenged myself to put a hum into every chapter.
Oh, very good.
Which is quite difficult. But so there's a bit of fun in there with some hums and yeah.
But there's a lot of fun too, I think, in the illustrations, which are extremely witty. They're in the E.H. Shepard tradition. Got to remember that E.H. Shepard, as well as being a children's book illustrator, did illustrations for Punch.
Yeah.
So he also had the gift of a cartoonist.
Yeah.
And your Mark Burgess here is very clever indeed. And his illustrations are terribly amusing. Do you have characteristics that liken you to Pooh? How good is your spelling?
It's actually terrible. I shouldn't say that because I was an editor for years. But when I was at school, I think everyone got quite worried about my spelling. And then suddenly I got the hang of it, but a bit later in life, maybe when I was 13 or something. So yeah, I do struggle with long words like Pooh. But I had a very good editor who helped with that.
So this is a book for anybody who loved the original A.A. Milne stories, wants to know what happened before. Anyone like me who's got grandchildren. I have to say, I've been reading this to the ones who are younger than 7, though you feel 7, you say, is the sweet spot. That's the right age.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think an alert, bright 5-year-old will give it a go, but they're quite long. Oh, of course, they're exceptional.
5 is certainly alert and bright, I can tell you. So from 5 to 105, you can enjoy Once There Was a Bear, Tales Before It All Began. And I think it has been superbly... do you know what I love? I'm sure it's available on Kindle and everything else, but I love the smell of the print. Do you know what books are? Books are our best friends. That's what a book is. A book is a good friend, a friend you can rely on. In life, you will find, as the years go by, you've obviously been very lucky in life so far, but you will find you can't always rely on your friends. As my wife often says to me, you can't often rely on your husband. Even if he's reasonable, he'll die eventually. But a book you can depend on. You can take a book everywhere and anywhere, on the train, on the bus, on the beach. You can go to bed with a book and wake up in the morning with a clear conscience. Yes. So I think a book is a wonderful thing. I'm very fond of 4 lines by Hilaire Belloc. Do you know these 4 lines? From quiet homes and first beginning out to the undiscovered ends, there's nothing worth the wear of winning but laughter and the love of friends. And what I think is lovely about this book is there's plenty of laughter in this book, and there are some of our best friends, because for me, Winnie the Pooh has been a constant and good companion. Finish up by telling us, maybe you want to read a little bit something, I don't know, or simply tell us what for you is Winnie the Pooh. Why is Winnie the Pooh so central to your life? You've become the embodiment of one of the greatest of all children's authors, A.A. Milne. You are his successor. Here you are. You have children yourself, don't you?
I do, yes.
At what age are they?
They're a little bit old for Winnie the Pooh, but they humoured me because what I have discovered, and it was interesting when you were saying that the Winnie the Pooh books were originally obviously spoken aloud to Christopher Robin, it was really important for me to read them aloud as I wrote, which obviously is a bit irritating when you're 13, isn't it? To hear your mum, Mum, listen to the next chapter.
Oh no!
But they were very helpful and gave me lots of feedback. So
Good.
yeah,
Good. No, I mean, I think you go through a phase. When I was a teenager, Winnie the Pooh was translated into Latin. Yes. Winnie the Pooh.
I've seen
Do you remember
it.
that?
Yes, yeah.
And so at my school, the sophisticated boys, who would have thought, Winnie the Pooh, it's child stuff. But if it was in Latin, it became more sophisticated. Right. And I think you then rediscover it when you go to university. I think Winnie the Pooh, when you're preteen, and then we go to university, and then for the rest of your life, yes, as long as you've got Pooh for company. Frankly, nothing can go wrong in the world as long as you've got Winnie the Pooh beside you. That's my take. But what is, you must have the last word. What's your take on Winnie the Pooh?
Well, I think that if we can all be as humble as Pooh, and not have too many Eeyore days, not have too much of Piglet's anxiety, and just have Christopher Robin's zest for life and for adventuring and for finding the next North Pole or whatever that might be for you, then you can't go too far wrong.
Well, you can't go too far wrong either if you get yourself Once There Was a Bear, Tales of Before It All Began. Thank you very much, Jane. We'll finish our tea, then we'll pop down to Harrods.
Oh, yes,
what do you think?
Do a bit of spotted shopping.
That'd be fun.